Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit just for continuity. Also, I think some people weren't here the last week or two, so we want to review this sugya and then move on. And I think it's best if we back up just a little bit to the two dots um, further up on Ayin Aleph Amud Beis, Ayin Aleph Amud Beis, about a dozen or so lines. The two dots Tana Rabbanan. And this way we'll pick up from Tana Rabbanan and just continue on. It'll be easier to understand the whole Gemara. So the subject here, pretty much, where we're talking about lending with interest, or borrowing with interest from a Nachri, from a non-Jew, and how that interplays into our system. Because of course, when you borrow from or lend to a non-Jew, the whole Indian of Rivas doesn't apply. So now there are some nuances to that the Gemara will, well, again, we're going to review, but the Gemara will tell us circumstances in which it's not that straightforward, and we have to understand the underlying reasons. So, Tana Rabbanan, the Rabbanan learned, okay, and this is from the Mishnah, Malva Yisrael Ma'osav Shanachri Midas Nachri, that a Jew can lend money from a Nachri. It's money that he borrowed from a Nachri, so already there's no interest, and he wants now to, so to speak, relend or pass the money on in loan to another Jew. So now we run into the problem of potentially having two Jews who are in line one after the other to lend to each other, and that becomes ribbis. It didn't start as ribbis because you had a goy, but if one Jew owes money to a goy and then wants to relend that money, or the other Jew wants to borrow that money, so what do? Is that money okay, or is it tainted, or what? So the Mishnah says that you can pass it on or relend it midas nachri, only with the das, the knowledge or consent of the nachri, avelo midas Yisrael, but not with the knowledge or the consent of the Yisrael. So that's the twist here. It's not straightforward borrowing or lending to a goy. It is borrowing from a nachri, relending the money. A Jew is borrowing the money from a nachri, relending it to another Jew. So in proximity, you're lending it to another Jew. Is that okay? Or is it really the Nachri's money? How do we look at it? So the Gemara says it all depends on.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I just want to ask a question
Can you,
here.
Jay, can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, I just wanted to ask a question. Um, if the Jew borrows, let's say, $1,000 from the Nochri,
Right.
and another Jew wants to need some money, so this first Jew says, "Okay, I'll give you $300. I can't give you 1,000 that I borrow, but I'm only giving you a portion of what I borrowed from the goy." Does that change the whole situation compared to lending him everything that he borrowed from the goy?
So the answer really is no, because it doesn't matter whether it's a penny, a dollar, or the entire $1,000. What matters is who is doing the lending. That's the key question. The amount, that's not significant. Whatever you lend, you lend. The question is it the Jew, the borrower, who is lending it directly from himself? Because he now has the money. He borrowed it from the goy. The money is now in
He
the
has
possession.
$1,000 in his pocket.
Yeah,
Okay.
$1,000 is in the possession, quote unquote, ownership of the Jew until he repays it. So it's no longer the Nachri's money; it's the Jew's money. If if the Jew has other money and he lends it to somebody else, okay, you can't lend with interest. But here he's specifically lending from the money he borrowed from the goy, and from the goy there's no ribbis. So the question is, when he now relends that portion, 300, 400, 500, the whole thing, is he lending the goy's money? And if he's lending the goy's money, then is there ribbis or not? So
But
this
the
is
heck,
what
the hector to borrow the 1,000, why doesn't
but
that
even
go
if it's not the full
along?
1,000, if it's even a portion of the 1,000, Jay,
Right.
that then it's still tainted from the standpoint that it is money from that source. So on the face of it, you would say, oh, he's just borrowing from the goy. So it should be another case of borrowing from the goy, and it should be a potter from ribis. There should be no ribis issue when you have to pay interest on the money from the goy. But the twist here is that since it's now in the rishus of the Jew, it's as if the Jew has now taken over that money. It's no longer the Nachri's money. It's now the Jew's money. So now if the Jew is going to lend it to another Jew and charge interest, why charge interest? Because the Goy originally said, I'm going to charge interest for 30 days. And that's fine. He was going to repay it in 30 days. Comes along another Jew and says, you know what? I need money for 60 days. Will you lend me this money, i.e., the money from the Goy? And I'll pay interest because it's money from a Nachri, and that's okay. So this is the question that the Rabbanan are grappling with and saying, no, it depends. It really does depend on what the perspective of this money is. Are you borrowing the Goy's money or are you borrowing the Jew's money? And that's the subtle difference as to whether or not interest is permitted. So the Rabbanan learn that if it's midas nachri, which we'll explain in a minute, if it's with the knowledge of the nachri, it's okay. But it can't be midas Yisrael. Below midas Yisrael, it can't be with the knowledge or agreement or consent of the Jew. So here's the now that we're going to lay it out. Dates on what happened. Yisrael shalabamos min hanachri beribis. A Jew borrowed money from the Nachri beribis, which is completely okay. Now, Ubikish Lachziro, he wants to return the money to the Nachri. He borrowed it for 30 days. He wants to return it. Motzi Yisrael Acher V'Amaro, another Jew knew that his friend had borrowed money from a Nachri. So he went to his friend, the borrower, and he said, Tanom li, give it to me. Give me the money, Vani Alalacha, and I will pay the additional interest the same way that you would have paid interest to the Goy. I'll pay interest to the Goy and extend it to me for 30 days. Says the Brisa, also, this is forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because in essence, it's a loan from one Jew, the first borrower, to another Jew, the second borrower, for interest, because that second Jew will pay interest for the additional, let's say, 30 days that the loan will be outstanding, and he's going to be paying it to the Jew, not to the Goy. This is the point. If the Jew is lending him the money for an additional 30 days, then he's paying the Jew the interest, and that's ribis, right?
So Rabbi, yeah, it makes sense if he said so because the first transaction between the Goy and the Jew. The second
Right.
transaction, the Goy is not in the middle of it, even
That's
though
correct.
it was the source of his money.
That's
However, if they modified the agreement and the Goy said, and he says to the Goy, I'm going to modify mine from 1,000 to 700 in the example, and this other person wants 300, and they redo the agreement so that it's from the Nachri to both separately, that's permissible, correct?
right. So what you're saying now is just the next line in the Gemara is going to tell us the himidu etzel nachri. Forget about the 700 and 300. Let's just say that the second Jew said to the first Jew, "You're about to repay $1,000. Give me the 1,000 and let me repay the 1,000 30 days later, and I'll pay interest." So says the Gemara, says the Brisa, what you just said, Michael. If the borrower came to the Nachri and said to the Nachri, will you lend the money? Then mutter. It's exactly the point. So if you involve the goy, if you involve the nochri as quote unquote the new lender, then you're home free because it's like you said, it's the goy who is now lending to first to the one Jew, now to the second Jew, because the second Jew wants to take over the loan, not even part of the loan. Let's take the whole loan, the whole $1,000. So we say that if the Nachri consents, it's as if the Nachri made the loan, not the Jew. But if you didn't go to the Nachri, like in the first case, and one Jew lent it directly to the second Jew, then you have a case of ribis because one Jew is lending the money to the other Jew, right? Okay. Now, so that's one case that the Brisa teaches us, where the lender was the Nachri. Now, B'chein, also, let's flip the script. Nachri shalava mos means Yisrael b'ribis. Now the Nachri was not the lender, but he was the first borrower. So a Jew had $1,000. He lent that money to a Nachri. The Nachri was the borrower. No problem, no ribis, no issue. Now the goy, the Nachri, wants to return the money. So he had a Jewish friend, and the Jewish friend said to the Nachri, "Give it to me. Let me take over the loan. I'll pay it back to the lender, and everything will be good. And I will pay him the way you would pay him." Then we say mutter, that it's permissible because it's the Nachri who's making the loan. Just like we said earlier, if Yisrael makes the loan, it's Osir. Here, the Nachri makes the loan. But Yisrael. But if the Nachri went to the Yisrael and said, you know, Yankel over there wants to borrow $1,000, and so why don't you two transact? I want to repay it. Yankel wants to borrow the 1,000 for another 30 days. Lend it to him. Says the Gemara, Osir, that's forbidden. So the two things we learned here is, on the one hand, the Nachri was a lender, and depending on how you couched the second loan, it is either ribis or not. And the second half is the Nachri is the borrower, not the lender. Lender was a Jew, but the Nachri was the borrower. Same set of facts. And he wants to now extend that loan to a Jew. So the question is, who is making the loan? If he's going back to the lender, the Jew, and saying, okay, the Jew is making the loan to the second Yid, that's Osir, because now you have ribis. But if they don't involve the actual original lender, the Jew, it's the Nachri who makes the loan, Nachri being the first borrower, makes the loan to the second borrower, then it is not ribis. So the bottom line is, it's very important how the lines of communication for the loan take place, as long as it's not quote unquote Jew to Jew, Yisrael to Yisrael. That if it is, it's ribis. If it's not, if it involves the goy to the Jew, whether the goy is the lender or the first borrower, it doesn't matter. In either case, it's mutter because there's no direct connection. So that's the important point here, is how you involve ribis. So if you're ever in a situation where, in fact, you're in business and you're borrowing money from a goy and you pay ribis, not a problem. Now you're in business and you have a subsidiary who happens to be Jewish, and that subsidiary goes comes to you, the Yid, and says, you know what? Continue to lend the money for an extra 30 days to the subsidiary, the Jewish subsidiary, and the Jewish subsidiary will repay the extra money as if you were repaid. Therein, although it seems like a pretty mild, straightforward case, therein lies the potential problem, is how that loan is being extended to the subsidiary. And that's why this is a real life case, because depending on how you couch the terms of that secondary loan, either becomes ribis or not ribis. That's what this price is telling us. Okay, So now we've covered both aspects of the loan, and now the Gemara wants to sort of delve into it and understand. That's why I backed up into this, because everything else we're going to talk about is based on this principle that we learned in this brisa. Now, having said that, says the Gemara, Bishloim Seifa, in the second part of the Seifa of the brisa. What's the second part? The second part was there was a Jewish lender and a non-Jewish borrower, and then he extended it to a second Jewish borrower, Bishloim Seifa, in the Seifa, right? So what do we say? We say that if you just continue the loan, it's also because it's a loan from one Jew to another Jew. So according to the Seifa, we say lechumra. What does it mean lechumra? That we're makbid when we have a case of a Jew lending to a Jew, we're makbid and we say lechumra that you may not do it, even with a nochri in the middle, because we say that nochri becomes a shaliach. So listen to this. The nochri would become a shaliach, an agent of the first lender, the Jewish lender, and ein shlichus l'nochri. We don't have shlichus to a nochri. There is no such thing as shliach to a nochri. So because of that, we say we are machmir, and therefore it is also to do it, because it'll turn out to be a loan from a Jew to a Jew, albeit the nochri in the middle, but the nochri will sort of disappear in this circumstance, and therefore it will be l'chumra, and therefore we say that we're machmir, that you can't do it. And that's the case of the Seifa, where the Jew was a lender, and the borrower was a goy, and then the second Jew was the second borrower. Now, what about in the first case, where the lender was a goy? It started out from an nochri, ela l'reisha, but in the first part, why do we say that it's permissible, right? That the second borrower, if he is introduced directly to the lender, the goy, it's as if the goy is making that second loan. Why do we say that? Given the ein shlichus l'nochri, we just got through saying that there is no shlichus to a nochri, that a nochri cannot be a shaliach. So then, if the first borrower is not a shaliach to put the lender, the goy, together with the second Jew, there's no shlichus, then who's actually doing the lending? One Jew is lending to another Jew, and that's ribbis. So notice the Gemara is saying you can't have it both ways. If you're going to say that we're machmir when the Jew is the lender and the nochri is a borrower, and therefore ein shlichus, he can't be a shalichus, he can't be a shaliach for the Jewish lender to the second Jewish borrower, to the second borrower who is a Jew, and therefore it's not permitted. Then don't change the rules. If those are the rules in ein shlichus, and there is no shlichus for a shlichus l'nochri, then in the first case, where the lender was a goy, was an nochri, then the borrower, the first borrower Jew who was lending to the second Jew, he can't be a shaliach for the original lender, for the goy. He can't be a shaliach for the goy. So the goy, so to speak, is out of the picture. Who's making the loan? One Jew to another. And if one Jew is making a loan to another, then it's ribbis. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Is if you introduce the principle of ein shlichus l'nochri, then both cases should have the same outcome, that you can't be a shaliach to a nochri, and therefore the bottom line is that the loan from one Jew to the other, regardless of whether the original lender is a goy or not, it's still one Jew lending to another, because ein shlichus l'nochri. So now we have a situation where in every circumstance where there is a secondary loan, there should be ribbis. How do you, the Brisa, make a distinction between whether it's the Nachri agreeing or the Nachri not agreeing? What difference does it make if he agrees? Ain't shlichus Nachri.
What's the so
For a Nachri in order to be the conduit to allow that Nachri to lend to a second person? So the Nachri's out. It's only one Jew to the other, and that's ribbis. Yeah, Jay.
what's the source of this no shlichus with a nochri?
All right, so we're gonna learn that today. Actually, it comes from Truma. By
Okay.
Truma, we say we're going to look at the pasuk. We're going to learn the pasuk that a Jew cannot make a goy a shaliach for Truma, and we learn from that. So the question is, it says Truma. So we learn from that that we enlarge the Isser to not just to Truma. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
That's the source. So if that's the source, then you can deal with a guy, no problem, but you can't be his shliach. You can't be his, and we're going to see how the Gemara is going to nuance that later as to why it might be permissible. But anyway, that's a little bit later.
But
so
the
right
guy
now,
also
shlichus anachri. So what difference does it make under what circumstance the case originated? As long as there's one Jew who's involved with another Jew, even with the goy being in the picture, the chayra, there should always be ribbis because en shlichus anachri. That's what troubles the Gemara here, is that you're making a distinction. Oh, in some cases it's okay. When you go to the goy and the goy will make the loan, fine, then it's a goy making the loan, not a yid. But if you don't go to the goy and you make it between two Jews, it's ribbis. Says the Gemara, but en shlichus anachri, it should always be forbidden. That's the Gemara's havamina. That's what the Gemara is thinking here, that this is a problem for us in any circumstance, which means in the real world of business, you could potentially have a problem because even if there's a nachri involved, that nachri may not be relevant to the question of ribbis. So that's the Gemara's whole clear here is, yeah, go ahead.
Is there ever a case when a nochri can be a shliach? I mean, we quite often when you need on Shabbos, you need a light to be turned on or something. You call it.
Yeah, but he's not a shliach. No. But you never make him a shliach because we have a klal shliach shel adam kamoso, that the messenger of someone is like the person himself. So if you order someone to turn on the light, it's as if you're turning on the light. That's why there's a subtle way, there's ways of doing it so that you're not the shliach. You can't make him a messenger for Devar Avera. He can't be a messenger. If you ask him to do an Avera, you're doing the Avera. Straight out. So you have to nuance it. You have to be careful in terms of what you say to allow for a nachri to do something on your behalf without being your shliach. That's really the key. And we can discuss that further. But for our purposes here, we see that since the ain't shliach l'nachri, it's problematic because it doesn't matter whether you say, oh, it's the goy who's making the loan, not the yid, therefore there's no interest. It ain't shlichus l'nachri, so we have a problem. So that's the kasha of the Gemara, and how do we deal with it? So the Gemara gives us an answer. And here we're going to go back and forth to try to understand the underpinning of the answer. Omar Rav Huna ba Manoach b'shved Rav Acha bar Rav Ika. So Rav Huna ba Manoach said in the name of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, what did he say? Hocha b'mayaskinan. You know what's the circumstance is that we're speaking about? So this is an interesting answer because what the answer is telling us is that in the course of commerce, there is no answer. You're right. If there's a goy and a yid and another yid, we're going to have a problem with ribbis. We will have a problem with ribbis because of the shlichus issue. But how do we solve the problem? So logically speaking, you solve the problem by cutting off the deal unequivocally. Once you cut off a deal unequivocally, then you can't say they're shlichus. You can't say, oh, you know what? one person's a shliach for another person. And no, the deal is unequivocally over. There's no shlichus. Says the Gemara, to go into Omalei, where the one party said to the guy, "Hinichem al gabe," or the guy said it to the Eid. Either way, "Hinichem al gabe karka v'hipoter." Put the money on the ground, and you're potter. So what does put the money on the ground a marshal for? The deal is done. There's no ancillary deal. There's no secondary loan. There's no extending of the loan. The deal is unequivocally over. So when you make that statement that the deal is unequivocally over, then what happens thereafter is a brand new deal, not connected. So how does that work for us? If you had a non-Jewish lender who lent to a Jew for 30 days, and you can pay him ribbis, no problem. Second Jew comes to the first Jew and says, you know what, let me take over your loan and I will repay the extra interest to the goy, not to you, I'll pay it to the goy. That is awesome. But what we're saying here is that when the first deal, the first 30 days came and the Jew had to repay, he said, end of deal. I mean, I don't know how many ways you can say the deal is over, but the deal is over. I'm paying you back. We are no longer connected. Tear up the documents. It's all over.
He pays
So
with the
if you
rivers.
take that position, then anything that happens thereafter, even though it might seem to be a continuation. Why? Because the Jew comes to the other Jew and says, do me a favor, let me just extend the loan for another 30 days and I'll pay the interest. The Torah says, that's not part of the loan. The loan was over after the 30 days unequivocally. So now, when there's a second loan, the second loan has nothing to do with the first loan. Says Rav Acha, he says, you know what? That loan is over. Therefore, there's never a shaila of whether or not there's shlichus by a goy, or whether or not a goy is lending to the Jew, or is it the Jew lending to the Jew?
What happened to the
We cut
interest?
it off unequivocally. Yeah.
What happened to the interest in the first
The
deal?
interest was paid at the time of the return of the loan. In other words, if the loan was for 30 days and there was interest on the loan, the
He pays
interest
it.
was paid,
Okay, so the first Jew has no more money.
has no more, has nothing. It's over. It's over, completely over. Now, what seems to be, so the problem was it looked to us like there was an extension of the loan. And that's where the problem arose, when there was extension of the
But the Jew can't lend it to another Jew. He doesn't have money.
That's exactly what the Gemara is saying, that the Jew can't lend it to the other Jew. It has to be unequivocally the goy lending it to the Jew, and therefore there's no ribbis. That's exactly the point of the Gemara, is that the Jew, technically, I mean, in reality, not technically, in reality, he repaid the loan. He has no longer any money to lend out.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah.
The Gemara is telling us that's the only way to get around this, is by saying emphatically the deal is over. There's no longer a continuation of the deal. Therefore, there can be no problem of ribbis or shlichus or whatever. So that's what the Gemara says, that he put the money down and he said, Zehu, that's it. All right, so that seems like a nice answer. Okay, we solved the problem. That in a case of a Nachri or even a Jewish lender, doesn't matter, and you have the circumstance where you have one borrower after the other borrower, you treat it as if the first borrower made a return payment unequivocally, and what happened thereafter is no longer part of the loan. That makes sense. That's a good answer. Except that in the Lashon of the Gemara says, if that's your answer, of course, everybody in the world will say that once you repay a loan, the loan is over. What's the chiddush? You're trying to tell me, oh, you know what? When a goy lends it to a Jew and then another Jew borrows from him, what do you mean? If the deal was over, then the next deal is a new loan. What chiddush is the Gemara? The Tana Rabbanan, the Rabbanan are going to give us a chiddush here. What's the chiddush? The is over.
There's no
And the
chiddush.
second deal starts anew. So
And there's
how do
no
you come
money.
out and say, want to be mechadish? Oh, depending on whether you have the knowledge of the Nachri, you don't have the knowledge of the Nachri, that's all irrelevant. The deal ended, and now you have a separate deal between a goy and a yid, whatever, period. So the Gemara says, my lememra, what are you coming to tell me? All right, Rav Papa. So Rav Papa wants to sort of modify the answer that, you know what, I'm going to give you a chiddush. It's not as if you put the money on the ground and the deal was over, and now there's a brand new deal. No, the goy took the money. He took the money that was being repaid, and he made a new loan. Now, that's a distinction without a difference. I mean, whether you say he physically took the money and put it in his pocket, and then took it out of his pocket and made a second loan, which clearly means that the first loan and the second loan are not connected, right? That's the first situation. You put it on the ground. Or you didn't put it on the ground. The Nachri took the money from the Yid, from the first borrower, right? Let's say the Nachri was the lender in that particular case. He took the money from the Yid, right? What did they do with it? Put it in his pocket. Okay, now he's making a brand new loan. So it's hard to understand what Rav Papa is really saying, because isn't Rav Papa saying the same thing that what we just said? You put it on the ground or you put it in his pocket. What difference does the Gemara make? Therefore, the Gemara asks the what's the chiddush here? Whether you put it in your pocket, you put it on the ground, or you hang it in the closet, what difference does it make? As long as you are disconnecting yourself from the first loan to the second loan, of course you can make a second loan with interest from the goy because there's no possibility of ribbis. And again, why do we do this? Because ribbis is such a serious offense that we've got to disconnect every which way possible to make sure that there's no appearance that there is money being transferred from one Jew to the other. That's the underlying reason. Okay, we get it. But what difference? You want to tell me that no, he didn't put it on the ground, but that he himself, the goy, took it back, and then he made a new loan to the other fellow. But that's the same thing. What are you coming to say here? So the Gemara has a problem here, because if you're going to tell me the whole chiddush was that, oh, we have a non-Jewish lender, and somehow the non-Jewish lender is taking over the loan and making it to the second Jew, therefore there's no ribbis. That was the whole Tana Rabbanan. You want to say that no, that's not what happened. What happened was there was a clear distinction between the first deal, a loan, and the second loan. I'm with you. If you make that clear distinction, whether you put it on the ground, put it in your pocket, it doesn't matter how you do it. Of course there is. So then Gemara constantly asks, what's the chiddush? What chiddush are you telling me if you're telling me that they totally disengaged and have nothing to do with each other, and then there's a brand new loan? Everybody and his uncle is going to agree that there's no ribbis, because
when you
one
look
deal
at it,
ended, another deal started. Yeah.
When you look at it from the money's viewpoint, it's pretty obvious. Nothing. There's no second loan here with the Jew involved. He's just not involved with this conversation.
That's right.
From the money viewpoint, the money gets repaid.
Right.
That deal is over.
Right. So maybe, I'm just thinking out loud. Of course, it doesn't matter. But maybe once you got repaid from the first loan, you take that money out of circulation and you make the loan from a new batch of money. In other words, you take out a different $100 from a different wallet or from a different source. But we don't have to go that far. We don't have to say it's new money. We can say it's the same money, but it's totally disconnected to the first deal. And that's the answer. But if that's the answer, what's the chiddush?
Right.
Then everybody will agree that under those circumstances, there's no ribbis. So what's the Gemara coming to tell? What is the Rabbanan? Tell Rabbanan that we have a chiddush here as to how we're going to make something happen without there being ribbis. there's no chiddush. So, okay, so that's the answer.
But it's not
Oh, so
solved.
this is Vakati Malamem. No.
Yeah.
Vakati Lamayim. So what are you going to say? It's the same thing. So the Gemara answers, Mahu de Tema. You would have thought in the normal course of events that Nachri Gufa Ki Oved, that when the Nachri is making the deal, Adat Yisrael Kagama V'Yahiv, that he's making the deal because of the first borrower. In other words, the first borrower has some kind of an influence on the non-Jewish lender, and therefore he's making the deal. So therefore, the Gemara is trying to explain why there is a chiddush. Because we're saying, what's the chiddush? Once you disconnect from the money, of course there's no ribbis. So the Gemara says there was a havamina. What was the havamina? That the Nochri only did it because
The
of
first Jew asked him
of
to.
his, let's say, his friendship or his relationship, whatever, to the first Jew. Therefore, there would be some kind of a connection between the first Jew and the second Jew, even though it's the Nachri making the loan. So you might think that that's not permissible. Mamash Malon, the Brisa tells us that no, that the Goy is not doing it because the Yid wants him to do it. The Goy is doing it because the Goy, wants to do it. And once we say that the Goy does it of his own initiative because he wants to do it, therefore there's no ribbis. So what do we have here? So the Gemara wants to again try to justify why there is a havamini in the Brisa that if you lend from a Goy to a Jew, that there might be ribbis or might not be ribbis. But here the Gemara explains to us that you know what the havamini is. The havamina is that the Goy might be influenced by the first borrower to lend to the second borrower, in which case that would be a tainted situation and we would be worrying about ribbis. Says the Gemara, don't worry. When in that circumstance, the Goy is doing it on his own initiative. He's not being influenced by the first borrower, and therefore, and under that circumstance, there cannot be ribbis. Again, this whole Gemara is really, it's food for thought. What are the circumstances in which a Jew and another Jew can get involved with a Goy and make a loan and maybe extend a loan? I mean, it's theoretical, but it's realistic that these kinds of circumstances can happen in business. So that's why the Gemara takes us through this whole exercise to tell us at the end of the day that we can rely, this is the point, we can rely on the fact that when, let's say the Nachri was the lender and he had a Jewish borrower and the Jewish borrower wanted to repay him, we could rely on the fact that he took the money from the Jewish borrower, he accepted that the loan was closed, and now he's making another loan, and we don't say that the second loan is tainted because the lender will somehow be influenced by the first Jewish borrower, and he'll make the loan. Says the Gemara, no, we don't accept that. That when he makes the second loan, he's totally making it on his own initiative, and therefore there is no ribbis between the non-Jewish lender and the second Jewish borrower, even though they're back to back. That was really the question. And maybe it's Maris Ayin. I don't even know if that even becomes an issue.
But there's another thing here that has to be looked at, I think.
Yeah.
Who will be the guarantor for the second Jew? It's a new loan, I agree that. But suppose the first Jew says, I'll be the guarantor for my friend.
Oh, right. So remember what we said, we're going to review it, but remember what we said, that if there is a guarantor in a deal, not every loan has a guarantor, Jay. There are loans without a guarantor, so we don't have to worry about it. If there is a guarantor, that clouds the deal even further, because the question is, who is he the guarantor for? That's a discussion that we had the other week. Right, but not every loan has an RA. Not every loan has a guarantor. Some loans you only have a guarantor theoretically, when the borrower isn't as strong and you need someone to stand behind him to make sure that he'll make the payment. So we say it depends on Fukas Agoy, it depends on the Jewish view or the non-Jewish view as to whether the Orev is the actual borrower or is not the actual borrower. If he's the actual borrower, then it's a whole different circumstance because they say that by the Goyim, when they lend, they're not really lending to a borrower, they're lending to a guarantor. And the guarantor is the one who has to collect from the borrower.
So even though this case is closed,
Yeah.
it has the possibility of getting it all mucked up again when you have a guarantor.
If you have a guarantor, yes. Yeah, then it can get all mucked up again if you have a guarantor. But the Gemara here wants to make it a little bit more simplistic and say, no, there was just a goy and a yid, and then another yid. No guarantor, no other confusion.
Okay.
How do we deal with it? So we deal with it by saying that unequivocally in every fashion, the first deal ended. There's no trail, there's no trace, there's nothing. The first deal ended, and therefore the second loan is a new deal. And if you will say, oh, the lender, the goy, is influenced by the fact that the first borrower was a Jew, was a friend of his, and therefore he may say, do me a favor, lend it to the other guy. Answer is, Kamash Malan, that the goy is doing it totally on his own. He's not being influenced in any fashion, and therefore you can't connect the two loans. And I think that's really the bottom line, is you have to sever the connection so that there's no hava amina that the two loans are in any way connected. If you can connect the two loans in some fashion, then we may have a rivas problem. But as long as we can say one deal ended unequivocally and the other deal started, then we won't have a question of that at all. All right, so that's how the Gemara comes to understand the Tana Rabbanan, that we do learn a circumstance where the goy transact with one yid and another yid, and then there is not rivas. Okay, so now the Gemara, that's why we review, because this Gemara has shaykhs. Now, so that's the answer. Is it a good answer? You be the judge. Obviously, there were Amoraim who maybe didn't like the answer very much, and they felt that maybe the answer was a little confusing. So the Gemara wants to go on and give us a different answer other than what we're saying now. So the whole question was about shlichus by an Achri. Is there shlichus by an Achri? So to your point, Jay, that we'd said before, what's the source? How do we understand shlichus by an Achri? So now we're going to dig into that a little bit and then see how that answers this question that we're talking about. Rav Ashi Omer, Rav Ashi says, what's the source of shlichus? Ki amrina and shlichus l'nachri. When we say there is no shlichus for a nachri, what are we talking about? Anu mili betruma. We're talking about truma because the Torah says that a Jew cannot make a goy a shaliach to take his truma. That's a pasuk in Bamidbar. Okay, fine. So hanamila betruma. Aval b'chol Torah kula. According to Rav Ashi, in every issue in the Torah other than truma, yesh shlichus l'nachri. There is shlichus to a nachri, and therefore that there is shlichus. And therefore, if we say there's shlichus, so one Jewish borrower, going back to our case, one Jewish borrower can act as a shaliach for the non-Jewish lender, and he gives the money to the second Jew, and there's no ribis because he's a shaliach of the nachri. So that's, in other words, that's how we want to understand the question. We don't have to go all through all these nuances because of the question of yesh shlichus l'nachri is very limited. Okay, so now that's an opinion, but the Gemara says no. Again, it's not that simple. The order of Ashi Barusahu. the Gemara says that Rav Ashi's ruling was not widely accepted, that most of the Amoraim did not hold like Rav Ashi that shlichus is limited, shlichus anachri is limited just to truma. Okay, why do we say that? Why do we say that the majority view, the overwhelming majority view, is not like Rav Ashi? Correct? Says the Gemara. This is the Chaf. Says the Gemara. What's the whole point of truma? Why is it that truma you can't give? Why? Maishno truma delo. What's the reason? But that by truma you can't make a shliach. You can't make the goy a shliach. Dichsid, because it says in the pasuk, atem gam atem. What does it say? The pasuk says that what's the lashon? Truma and gam atem. Also, you cannot. Hold on. Let me just see if he brings down the lashon here. I can get it finished. So he says, okay. He says the pasuk is kain torimu gam atem. The Torah says, and by Midbar, that so shall you give truma. Kain torimu gamatem. That so shall you give truma gamatem also you. It's a cryptic way. It's an unorthodox way of saying how you give truma. So the Gemara wants to learn like this: Ma'asher truma delo. Why don't you have by truma that you can make a shliach t'ksiv gamatem also you, right? What does it mean also you? That you have to be the one who gives the truma. Ma'atem b'nei bris. Now, what's the underlying reason why you have to give it? Because you're a Jew, and mitzvah truma is a mitzvah that comes from b'nei bris. We learn then afshluchachem nami b'nei bris. So therefore, we learn that if it's gamatem, that you have to be the person because it's you. Who are you? A yid, a b'nei bris, that you're a Jew. Therefore, it follows that everybody who can separate truma has to be like you, b'nei bris, right? Okay. So that's the standard. The standard is that you have to be a b'nei bris in order to give truma, says the Gemara. So what does that have to do with Rav Ashi? Shlichus t'chol ha'Torah kulanami b'truma gamrin. And shlichus for the rest of the Torah, we learn, how do we know shlichus? From truma. So it follows then that if we learn it from truma, just like truma, you have to be a b'nei bris, ben bris, in order to make a shliach. Then why can you make a goy a shliach for every other situation other than truma if you have to be a ben bris? In other words, the logic of why only a Jew can be a shliach and truma should apply to every mitzvah in the Torah, because the underlying reason is your ID, your identification as a b'nei bris, and that doesn't change whether you're buying an esrog for somebody or you're doing a mitzvah of tzedakah for somebody. Why should that be a difference? Why should a non-Jew be able to do your mitzvah, be your shliach, and he's not a b'nei bris and you are? So that's why the wide view doesn't hold like Rav Ashi, right? Therefore, the Rav Ashi Barusahi, Rav Ashi was considered an outsider. What does it mean as an outsider? Is that we couldn't support Rav Ashi's view that you learn it from Truma, and therefore that's the reason. So the Gemara tried to tell us another reason why a goy, a nokri, can make the loan is because only truma a goy can't be a shliach, but you can be a shliach. In this case, for a loan, for ribbis, you can be a shliach. And says the Gemara, Rav Ashi is not correct. Rav Ashi's theory of why a Jew can't appoint a goy to give truma applies to every mitzvah in the Torah, because the underlying reason is identity. Identity is what makes the shlichus possible. And if you're not a yid, then it doesn't matter if it's truma or something far less than truma. In any case, so therefore we can't hold like Rav, and therefore Rav's teretz is not a good teretz. Again, this is all comes back to our Gemara because we wanted to find a teretz as to why the shlichus is okay. Says the Gemara, not okay, because we're learning from truma and it's not okay. All right, Gemara doesn't give up easily. Ika the Amre. There's a different version. Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, Ki Emrei shlichus l'nafri. When do we say that there's no shlichus for a nafri? Hanamile inu lididon. You know what? We're going to bifurcate the halacha. They can't be a shliach for us. Why? Because they are not like us. We are b'nei bris. They are not b'nei bris. Avol anan ledidu havina lo shliach. But how about us becoming a shliach for them? What do they have that we don't have? We have b'nei bris, and they don't. Therefore, they can't be our shliach. But why can't we be their shliach? They don't have anything that disallows us from becoming their shliach. And if we say that we can become their shliach, then we have a circumstance where shlichus by a nafri, in the case of ribis, can work, is when we're their shliach. Okay, so we won't have it in all cases, whether we are theirs or they are theirs. But at least in the case where we're a shliach for them, that's okay. We can become a shliach for them because there's no barrier that doesn't allow us to do it. So the Gemara now wants to separate out and say there's a difference between shlichus for them or shlichus for us. Yeah, Jay?
When you talk about the shlichus for them, how does it relate back to the borrowing of the money case?
Oh, okay. In other words, so when they have a non-Jewish lender, and I'm allowed to be his shliach because there's no prohibition, so I can turn around and give that money to another Jew, and it's as if it comes from the lender, from the non-Jewish lender, because I can be his shliach. So
But they learned this out from Truma. The guy doesn't have a requirement for Truma.
But in Ikad the Amre, there's a difference in Truma. Truma we learn because you can't make him your shliach. But Truma has nothing to do with we're becoming their shliach. Truma is a one-way street. We have Truma, and you can't make the shliach, my shliach to make Truma. But the Truma doesn't talk about the other way around, but we're a shliach for the non-Jew, and therefore the Ikad Amri wants to say, okay, we can't have it both ways, but at least we can have it one way, that we are the shliach for the non-Jew, and therefore when the non-Jewish lender wants to lend to a second yid, that's okay because it's coming from the non-Jew, not from me, the Jew. It's not me, the yid, who's lending it to the other yid for ribbis. I'm a shaliach to the nafri who's now lending. So the Ikad Amri asks, why can't that be? No, okay, we'll settle on a half a loaf. We won't get the whole loaf. We'll settle on a half a loaf. That the half a loaf allows us to be a shliach for the goy, and that should be good enough, right?
But does that imply all cases you can be a shliach for a goy, except not for truma?
Except, yeah, so truma is the only circumstance because you're making him your shliach. See, by truma, the goy has to be my shliach, but where I'm a shliach for the goy, there's no mitzvah in the Torah where I have to be a shliach for the goy. The goy has no mitzvah that he can obligate me to be his shliach. If he wants to give charity, then he can't. I'm not his designee for charity. Charity has nothing to do with anything. So we see a case where potentially there's a break here where we're allowing the non-Jewish lender to lend to the second Jew. And when the first Jew becomes a shliach, and that's okay, he's a legitimate shliach, and we don't passel him. So that's the Ikad the Amre wants to say. So the Gemara says no. We still v'hodra of Ashi barusahu, that Rashi's whole view of shlichus by truma is the only reason that it's not it doesn't matter. Now we're going to understand why it doesn't matter. It's up to Gemara. Um, we
What's the difference?
understand that when a goy is to become a shliach for the Jew, atem gam atem l'rabba shluchaschem mo atem b'nei bris shluchem b'nei bris. So we understand the one hand because the fact of a b'nei bris, the fact of a b'nei bris disqualifies the non-Jew from being my shliach, because my shliach has to be like me. We have a statement in the Gemara, shluchei shel adam kamoso, and just like a person who is a b'nei bris can do something, you have to be a b'nei bris. But non l'didan nami, we want to give a different. So the kasha was, what about if we're a shliach for the goy? So we say anan l'didan nami. We can't be a shliach for them. Why? Ma atem b'nei bris ka'oma. Because we're going to flip it over that the statement of b'nei bris, mo atem b'nei bris ka'oma, because when it says, just as you are a member of Klal Yisrael and a Nochri is not, therefore he cannot act as your shliach. So in other words, the Gemara wants to refute what we just said as being a split case, because they're saying that when you are a shliach for somebody else, then you take over their identity. No, it's not just, oh, I'm a shliach, I'll carry forward what they're asking me. According to the Torah, when you're a shliach for somebody else, you are somebody else. Now, you are that person.
The Jew can't become a goy.
You can't become a goy.
They can't have the goyish identity for anything.
That's the point. That's the point. Look, it sounded really good to say, okay, I can't make a goy a shliach, but what's wrong with me being a shliach for a goy? We have nothing to do with each other. The Torah says we do have something to do with each other, because by definition, when someone becomes a shliach, even if it's a non-Jewish circumstance, then you are the identity of the mishulach, of the person who is sending you, and that can't be, because he's a goy. So therefore, we extrapolate from this Elahod Rav Ashi Barusahu, that Rav Ashi is really not correct. He's making a mistake when he says that we learn it out from Truma, but only from Truma and not from any other mitzvah. Now, there's no other mitzvah. We don't hold like Rav Ashi. And basically, we say that all mitzvahs in the Torah come, with regard to shluchas, comes from Truma, and the reason is because we are a yid just like they are a yid. So, in other words, just to know forever, for the future, that every time you do a shlichus, the term shlichus can only apply to, now, ger. If a person becomes a ger, then you can have shlichus with a ger, because a ger it becomes a yid, even though his ancestry wasn't. But ancestry isn't part of the mitzvah here of shlichus when it comes to truma. But
how can you be a shliach for a woman under the fact that you take on that identity?
Well, it's a good question. It doesn't have to do with this issue, because a woman is a Jew just like a man is a Jew. But you're right that shlichus by a woman is limited only to those things that she is mechuyev on. So if I gave my wife $1 to put in tzedakah, she can be my shliach, because there's no prohibition of her giving tzedakah. She's my shliach. But when I want to do lulav, I say, oh, I can't do lulav, I'm sick, I'm going to ask my wife to do lulav. She can't do lulav for me, because she can't have shlichus, mitzvah say, she has mind grama, whatever. But so in other words, with a woman, or a cotton for that matter, there are distinctions of when they can become a shliach. The identity portion is never a problem, because they're a Jew like we are, so there's never an issue. The only issue stems from the fact is whether or not they are commanded to do the mitzvah and you have to be commanded to do the mitzvah in order to be a shliach for the mitzvah. So that's a different circumstance.
Yeah.
But
I don't like my question.
you know, right, right.
It wasn't a good
Let me say
question.
this: if a woman owned a field and there was no husband, there was no man, is she mechuyev in truma? She's mechuyev in truma.
Sure.
She has to give truma because truma goes with the fields. It doesn't go with the person. So therefore, she's a Jewish woman. She has a chiyuv. So again, it's nuanced, but because we have some mitzvahs that go with the person, some mitzvahs that go with the chayfetz, with the field, whatever it happens to be, and depending on how that mitzvah is couched, then therefore there's a difference. Okay, we can go a little bit further because we start a little bit later. So again, we give you the answer that Rav Ashi's source is not correct, and therefore we have to fall back to the answer that we gave before, that by the Nachri, he's doing it of his own volition, and he has no connection. He's not influenced by the Jew in any fashion, as much as that may not be a totally satisfactory answer, but it's sufficient for us. Okay, now Ravina Omar. So Ravina comes to try to give us a different answer to this whole shaila, and he says, "Nehi de shlichus l'nachri leslei." I agree that there is no shlichus nor nachri. Why? Because we learned from Truman you can't. But listen to this: Zechio midrabanon islay. We're going to now make a distinction between shlichus, being a shliach, and being zechius, being zachala. Remember, many moons ago, we learned in a Gemara that if I come to you and I want you I want somebody else to have a certain chayfetz. So I'm not giving it to him outright. I'm giving it to you that you should be zachui for him, that you're taking it for him. So there's this concept of zachui la'adam shaloi b'fanav, that if I want to give something to you, not in front of the person who is going to be the recipient, that I can do that as long as it's a positive. You can't do a negative, but you can do a positive. That's not shlichus. That is not being a shliach. Says Ravina, I agree shlichus. There's no shlichus by a goy, but zechiyah midrabanan islay. But there is zechius by a goy. Why? Miditahaba cotton. A goy is no worse than a cotton. So what does this mean? Cotton, a minor lav afagav to leslay shlichus, even though a cotton, there's no shlichus by a cotton. So therefore, you can't make him a shliach for you. But islay zechiyah midrabanan. But he has the power. Zechiyah means basically acceptance. It doesn't mean transference. It means acceptance. So islay zechiyah midrabanan. He has the power to be zachui, to accept something for somebody else under divrei rabbanan. Hachinami lo shno. So therefore, it should be no different here. So the Gemara wants to try to give an answer and say, all right, we're looking at this incorrectly. You don't want to make the guy the nachri shliach. I get it, but you can make him a recipient, a zachui, and if he's a zachui, then you can still somehow transfer the money from the goy to the yid through zechius, not through shlichus. So therefore, according to Ravina, that would be a valid way of understanding the Gemara, is that the Gemara is telling us that a goy, a non-Jew, can be zoiche, and he can transfer money to a yid, and there should not be ribis because it's zechius, and zechius is allowed midrabanan. So again, we're trying to give that answer. So says the Gemara, no, below he, there's a difference between, and where do we learn it from? We learn this whole thing from cotton, because by cotton we say that a cotton can be zeiche, therefore a non-Jew should also be zeiche. Answers the Gemara no. Yisrael also lechlal shlichus. There's a difference. A Jew, even if he is a cotton now, and he can't do a shlichus, when that cotton becomes a gadol, he becomes bar mitzvah, and he becomes a gadol, then that zechius becomes shlichus. So there is a potential for a cotton to become a shliach. Therefore, we allow him, while he is still a cotton, to have zechius, basically, to become a zocher. Akum will also lechlal shlichus, and Akum will never reach the level of shlichus, whether he's a bar mitzvah or not a bar mitzvah, because ein shliach legoy, ein shliach lenachri. Therefore, we don't allow it even by a cotton. Again, the Gemara is very nuanced here, and as is typical in understanding the Gemara, we always trying to find a common denominator or the lack of a common denominator that will distinguish two things. So here we're saying, wait a minute, why is a goy worse than a cotton? And we say that a cotton can be zoiche midrabanan, that he can zoiche, he can accept as a schus for somebody else. So a goy should also be zoiche. And for the Gemara, no. The reason why a cotton can be zoiche is because a cotton has the potential to become a gadol if he grows up, because bar mitzvah. Therefore, we allow zechius because he will become and have shlichus. But a goy who should be like a cotton, he can never reach the level of shlichus, and because of that, we don't allow him to be zocha either. So this is another example where the Gemara tried to give an answer to our question by drawing a distinction between shlichus and zechius. And at the end of the day, the Gemara says, no.
Why did they change the language from Nochri to Akum?
You know, it's an interesting question because I'm not 100% sure, because the two terms technically are not I mean, they both mean a non-Jew, but one is an Ovid Avodah Zarah, one is not. So we use the term Nochri and not Akum. I'm not exactly sure why the Gemara switches here, because to be consistent, it should say Nochri. You're right, but
all right.
Again, I'll check to see if it's
not a gavaldic
to be relevant. If it actually has an intent here to be an Akum rather than an Nochri. But the underlying principle we understand is that whenever we can find a way to distinguish two matters, however we distinguish. Here we can distinguish a cotton from a Nochri or an Akum. We can distinguish because since a cotton can become a gadol, therefore he has the potential of shlichus. Therefore, zechius is okay. But when you don't have the potential for shlichus, because a goy is a Nochri, he'll never have shlichus. Therefore, he doesn't even have zechius. He may be compared to a cotton for some things, but he can't have zechius because, just like we say, b'nei bris, someone who's a b'nei bris, he's the one who can do it. But if you're not a b'nei bris, then you can't do it. So too, if someone cannot grow into shlichus, therefore he can't have zechius. So bottom line, with all these different terutzim, we distinguish Rav Ashi, we distinguish Ravina, and we're back just to our original teretz, and that is that we will not accept the fact that a goy, even though he's a goy, we're not going to accept the fact that he will be influenced by his Jewish friend to make the loan, and therefore that loan will seem to be made by the Jew. The whole problem was we want to avoid appearance of a Jew lending to a Jew. So we said, all right, throw it on the ground, or all these other things that we said. At the end, the Gemara says, no, we don't have to throw it on the ground. We would have thought that the goy would be influenced by the Jew, and therefore he can't make the loan to the second Jew. Says the Kamash Malan, that a goy is not going to be influenced, and therefore he's allowed to make it. That's the answer, and we have to live with that answer because we tried giving all these other answers and they didn't work. But again, I think one of the reasons why we say this, it comes back to the point we make at the very beginning. Ribis is a very serious offense. So if there's ribis, there's ribis. There's no way around it. But if we can find a way to soften the blow and to say, no, you know what, it's not really ribis, we want to do that because we don't want one Jew to be over Allah. In this particular case, if we didn't say what we said, then one Jew who is transferring the loan to another Jew can really be involved in ribis because it's one Jew to another. It's not the Gentile. It's not the Nachri. So we have to find a way to soften the image or soften the blow so that there should not be ribis. Therefore, we come to the conclusion, you know what? I mean, for other reasons, we might say the Goy is not such a good guy. But for purposes of the ribis, he has a mind of his own, and he's making the loan. He's not influenced by the first Jew. And therefore, when he makes the deal, it's strictly from the Nachri to the second Jew without the first Jew being involved. And therefore, there's no way, no how that the first Jew can be over ribis. That's really what we're talking about here is how do we get away from hanging that terrible mantle of ribis on another Jew? We say that the Goy has a mind of his own and he is what he is. There's all kinds of stories about, I mean, throughout the Gemara, but even anecdotally about Yidden and Goyim and doing business and influencing. I mean, there's a lot of stories in the Gemara and other circumstances. So we want to give the impression that the Goy, he's malleable. We can make from him what we want to make from him. And therefore, we sort of make fun in a way of the Goy. But the truth of the matter is that the Gemara wants to be very steadfast and say that the wall of separation between a Jew and a non-Jew is such that we don't want to suggest that the Jew has an influence over the Goy to make that other loan. But it's a very interesting process because
the Gemara has total respect. The Gemara seems to have total respect for the Goyim.
Yes.
No matter what.
I think you're correct. In other words, we don't want to just put a slight on them. Oh, they're light-headed and they're this and they're that. I mean, a Goy is a Goy. There's no question about it. But when it comes to certain things, then we do make that very distinct separation. And this is very, very important to make the separation when it comes to ribis, is that a Goy has his own mind, and therefore, and all these other terutzim that we try to give, we didn't want to come on to it. So Rav Ashi gave an answer, Rav Hyatt gave an answer, but we slugged it all up. We said, no, those answers aren't correct, and therefore we're left with this particular situation. Okay, so interestingly, I mean, we're going to go back to next week, and the subject of next week, we're going to start talking about a Goy who's Megayer and becomes a Yid. How does ribis affect the fact that he was lending when he was a Goy? I mean, again, the Gemara comes up with many different nuances because there's many different permutations as we have. We probably have situations where in real life some of those things happen. So it's next week we'll continue. Everybody should have a wonderful Chag, Kabbalah Torah, and if we're Makabel the Torah, then we may be in a different circumstance next weekend. But if not, we'll be back next Sunday, Mitzvah Shem, and we'll continue on.